During the sittings of the South African Convention at Cape Town, some 7 years after Rhodes's death, an English woman, recently landed, the daughter of an English statesman, was describing to some of us her first impressions of the Cape Peninsula. The charm of Cape Town and its surroundings, Rondebosch, Winburg, Sea Point, Muizenberg, lovely even in their names. The mountain dominating them all, the clear, clean South African air, and its wonderful light. These she felt and saw, as all must who have ever touched there. But there was something more, a haunting sense of some dominating personality present but unseen everywhere. Table Mountain, with the town and villages nestling in its kloofs, seemed to have some great spirit brooding over it. And in men's talk, there was always a reserve, as of some idea too familiar yet too impressive to be much talked about. Then it had dawned upon her that the haunting personality was that of Rhodes. And the mystery was explained, for everything appeared to call up associations with Rhodes. The statue of the old Dutch governor Van Riebeek in the quay to greet the stranger on his arrival in South Africa was his gift. The road round the mountain was planned by him with the loving thought that human beings would walk that road long after he had gone. The old Dutch blockhouse on the mountain was preserved from destruction by him. Grote Schuur at Rondebosch, with its ample grounds and its masses of hydrangeas, was his home, left for the public service of a united South Africa. In the tiny cottage by the sea at Muizenberg, he breathed his last painful breath. The monument on the mountainside marks the seat where he used to sit musing and staring at the view of both oceans, or gazing towards his own country in the north. Like stout Cortez, silent upon a peak in Darien. The very work of union, for which the chosen men of every state in South Africa were then assembled at Cape Town, was his constant preoccupation, and was now recalling him at every turn. "Oh, if we only had Rhodes here," exclaimed a Dutchman from the Transvaal when some almost fatal obstacle had presented itself in the convention. A Dutchman who in Rhodes's lifetime had been fighting him and his countrymen. "Let us not bother about these details. We are out for the big thing," said another delegate. This one, a dear friend of Rhodes, unconsciously echoing almost the very words of his chief. Nor were these experiences singular or confined to the period of the National Convention, when men's minds were all intent on one of Rhodes's great ideas. The German colonial secretary, Dernberg, who visited South Africa a little later, had the same vivid sense of his personality, for what he said impressed him most in the country was the omnipresent glamour of Rhodes. Later still, on the eve of the war, the feeling of his presence is as fresh and living. "The spirit of the man permeates the place," writes a visitor to Groot Schuur in 1914, an ancient opponent of Rhodes, not merely because of the books, the old Dutch objects, and the furniture he collected there, the rare trees he planted, and the animals he acclimatized in the grounds, and his favorite view from the stoep, still remembered, but for the passions he aroused and the ideas he stimulated. This vivid remembrance of Rhodes was not confined to the Cape Peninsula, his home, if he can be said ever to have had one, for the last 10 years of his life. For many years after his death, it was the same throughout South Africa. In Natal, where he was least known, the few men who knew or worked with Rhodes are pointed out to the stranger at the club as among those specially to be noted and talked to. And sooner or later, the visitor is bound to hear the story of Rhodes winning over their Prime Minister Escombe. Till then, somewhat suspicious, by the invitation to Grootschuur to discuss South African Union with its postscript. Besides, the hydrangeas are in full beauty. It would be a pity to miss them. In the Transvaal and the Free State, where he was once regarded by many besides old President Kruger as Apollyon, a financier, and the foul fiend himself, if Rhodes had not been born, South Africa would have been little less than a paradise. His death has mellowed men's judgments, and it is remembered that with all his faults and in spite of the raid, he was a great South African. While in Johannesburg, it is still not forgotten that he was one of the founders of its prosperity. In the native territories of the Cape, his creation, the Glen Grey system, has profoundly modified the condition and outlook of the black community. Among the Dutch of the Cape, he is not only remembered for the betrayal of the raid, but as a farmer, such as themselves, who loved the land as they do and felt with them in all their troubles. The Kimberley of today, for good or evil, is merely what he made it by the De Beers amalgamation and Bechuanaland, the Suez Canal to the interior, might never have been British but for Rhodes. For Rhodesia, he is the one man. Jameson indeed is remembered with affection. Gray and Milton and all the directors of the Chartered Company had their good qualities, but since he died, it has never been quite the same there for white men or natives. The lame dogs among the whites he helped materially or cheered with brave words. The stalwart felt that his curt approval was worth working for, and all knew that, whatever might be the difficulties, he would surely be there to see the country through. By the natives he was trusted blindly for his just dealings and the respect he showed them. To him alone among white men they gave the royal salute of their tribe. Here, above all, his memory is cherished, in the country he won and loved. And here he rests on the hill called the View of the World, amid the grandeur and loveliness of the Matopos. Even South Africa's wide expanses were too narrow a field for Rhodes. He is the only colonial statesman who has to such extent struck the imagination and affected the thoughts of Englishmen at home and throughout the world. The very suddenness with which he loomed upon the outer world helped to concentrate attention upon him. A few years before he became Prime Minister of the Cape, he had hardly been heard of in England. During a debate of 1884, Lord Randolph Churchill spoke scornfully of some cipher appointed to supersede the missionary Mackenzie in Bechuanaland. A cipher whose appointment the minister was hard put to it to defend as of a gentleman of some distinction who had always shown himself to be a great sympathizer with the native races. Less than 6 years later, the cipher's name was on every tongue as the autocrat of one of the greatest industrial undertakings in the world, as Prime Minister of his colony, and as the founder of what promised to be a vast new dominion for the empire. At home, indeed, the quality of his eminence was never so incontestable as at one time it was in South Africa. To many, he was a bugbear, the type of the dishonest and unscrupulous politician who uses politics to rig the market and the wealth thus acquired to corrupt politics. A man who filched away an empire and slaughtered innocent savages or plotted against a friendly state to put money into his own and his fellow conspirators' pockets. Rank selfishness and an indistinguishable love of power and renown, of adulation and of praise are the prevalent characteristics which distinguish this eminent statesman and conqueror from the small fry. Such is another, perhaps extreme instance of the form of obloquy to which he was exposed. On the other hand, to many more he had soon become a national hero, on a par with a Clive or a Warren Hastings, and by the few who consorted familiarity with him he was treated as little short of infallible and impeccable. Since his death, Oxford and its Rhodes scholars have helped to keep his memory green and to further his ideals even beyond the shores of England. At Oxford, his statue looks proudly down upon the high, taking rank above the sovereigns of his day, as a founder no less than William of Wykeham, Chichel, Waynflete, or Wolsey. In our law courts, Rhodes' words of some 30 years ago still have weight in a decision on the fate of a vast territory in the heart of Africa. And for long, ardent young missionaries of empire have been devoting themselves to the problems of imperial government on principles which he initiated. Today, except in his own Rhodesia, the glamour of his great name is somewhat dulled. Many of the faithful friends, men like Jameson and Gray, jealous guardians of the reputation and tradition of Rhodes, which they themselves had helped to form, have passed away. The war, which raised so many new problems and brought forward so many new men, has for the time being obscured Rhodes and the Rhodes ideas. South Africa itself, where he played his chief part, no longer holds that prominent place in the world's eye which it held for 10 years and more before his death and during the decade which succeeded it. Perhaps, by very reason of this partial eclipse, it is opportune to attempt another judgment on Rhodes. Hitherto, most of the lives or sketches of him have been written under the attractive magnetism of his living personality. Today it may be possible to take a more dispassionate view. Most of the written material ever likely to be available for his life is now accessible, and so much has happened in the last 18 years that his career can be judged not only by the passions which it raised, but by the test of the effects which it has produced. On the other hand, it has still not been too late to gather living impressions of the man from those who saw him plain, who knew him and listened to his actual words, who can describe his gestures, the tone of his voice, and some of his unguarded moments. Such evidence is especially valuable in the case of a man like Rhodes, who wrote very few intimate letters and received few. For the account of such a man depends for its value not so much on what he did as on why and how he did it, and that can only be obtained by close acquaintance with the man himself. This book is not intended to be an unrelieved panegyric of Rhodes or a tract for the imperialism he preached and worked for, but it frankly sets forth with the belief that he was, with all his grievous faults, a great man, and that at the root of his imperialism were qualities that have done good service to mankind. His character was cast in a large mould, with enormous defects corresponding with his eminent virtues. But from the recital of these shortcomings, no less than that of his achievements, help, we think, may be gained by those moved by the same spirit of devotion to what they believe best for England and the world. As to his creed of imperialism, a worthy spirit will be engendered if we look not to the blatant and exaggerated manifestations of national arrogance it contained, but to its deep sense of public duty, the tenacity of purpose it implied, and above all, to the underlying sympathy and desire for cooperation, even with opponents, without which it was meaningless.